Just over 3,000 years ago, King David asked a really good question I believe we're still asking today. He said this in Psalm 11, when the foundations for good collapse, what can good people do? Man, that's a really good question, isn't it? Have you ever had a situation in your life where you felt your foundation was shaken? And what you thought was stability in your life all of a sudden wasn't so stable anymore. It's a good question. What do good people do when the foundation of their life is shaken? And so what do you do when illness invades your body? What do you do when all of a sudden you're grieving the loss of a loved one? What do you do when you find your marriage struggling? You never experienced that before. What do you do when the job of your dreams, you lost it, and now all of a sudden all these bills are piling up and you have no idea how you're going to pay for them? When your life is shaken, what do you do? One of the things that I have experienced in my life is that when my life has been shaken, it's kind of revealed some things. It's actually revealed in me where I have kind of placed my foundation in areas that maybe I shouldn't have. Like, have you experienced a little bit of stress or anxiety over the economy and all of a sudden your 401k that you thought was doing pretty good, well, it ain't looking quite so good anymore, and you're a little worried about is the amount that we've saved up to live on for our retirement, is it enough? Or maybe you've just found a lot of stress and anxiety over trying to pay for things that have just gotten more expensive and your paycheck isn't going quite as far as it used to. It can sometimes reveal that we put our foundation in an individual and we thought that person was the one that brought us stability in our life, but then we lost the relationship. Something broke down or tragedy struck, and now all of a sudden I feel like my life is completely out of sorts. What do you do when you feel like the foundation of your life is collapsing? So last week we started this series called Anxious for Nothing, where we're looking at this text. We read it last week, we'll read it this week, we'll read it next week, and we'll read it the week after that. And I hope you'll be reading it every day in between then as well. And I appreciate Hurston being willing to read that for us this morning. But last week we started out looking at the life of Elijah. Elijah had this moment where he realized he was at a breaking point. Some things that happened in his life, really important, really good things happened, and then all of a sudden he found himself at rock bottom, and he was at a breaking point. He'd had enough, and he's all alone, and it's just him and God, and he wants it all to be done with. He wants to be just taken out of this world. He's at a breaking point. And what we looked at was Elijah's life had gotten really loud. There was a lot that was going on, a lot of insecurity, a lot of doubt, a lot of fear that was filling his heart with anxiety. And he prayed to God. And God showed up not in a very loud way, because when your life gets loud, God doesn't try to shout above the noise. When God showed up for Elijah, it was in a whisper, a gentle whisper, because he was inviting Elijah to come near. And that's what we looked at in Philippians 4 last week. The Lord is near. When life gets loud, God invites us to draw near to him. Well, today I want to look at a different part of Philippians 4 in this text that we've been reading. Over the last couple of weeks, the check engine light on my truck has been coming off and on. It'll come on for about a day, and then it'll go off after about a day, and it'll stay off for, several days, maybe a week, maybe longer. It's just kind of a gamble on whether or not it's going to come on today or not. And I know the smart thing to do would be to take it to the shop and to have it looked at, but that's really inconvenient right now, right? And so I just kind of get in and say a little prayer that hopefully that today's the day that it doesn't turn into something worse. And so what I've thought about is anxiety is a lot like that, because when that check engine light comes on, it's a sign, it's a signal that something's wrong. And if it's not addressed, it could potentially turn into something even greater, a far greater problem than I even know of what's going on. And anxiety is like that, right? When you feel yourself stressed and anxious, it's a signal that something's going on in your life that needs to be checked. I told you a story last week. I'll remind you again. Just a couple weeks ago, I was feeling stressed and anxious. My family could feel it from me, and Haley said, "Why are you stressed?" I have no idea why I was stressed. But that was a signal in my life alerting me something's going on. I didn't even know exactly what it was, but it was a signal alerting me. I don't know how you deal with stress. When you get anxious, what do you do? For me, I am like the president of the nail biting club. Any nail biters when you get stressed and anxious? I'll never show you my fingernails. Please don't look at them. A little self-conscious about. Stop. Stop. I see you on the front row. You're trying to check them out. I'm just going to preach like this the rest of the morning, but I don't know what yours is. Maybe yours is you kind of double down when things get out of control in your life. You just really start to try to control something else. So you go to work even more. You work even harder. You work on your yard even more. You just double down on whatever it is that you can control. Maybe you're the type that withdraws. You just kind of pull back from everybody, kind of keep to yourself. Maybe you just start sleeping more. You sleep a lot more when you're stressed and anxious. Maybe you just go to Walmart and you buy a bucket of Blue Bell and you just eat your stress away in ice cream, and that's a great way to deal with it too. I don't knock that. Maybe you're the complete opposite. You don't down it with Blue Bell. You go to the gym and you exercise even more. My prayer is that none of us would ever resort to what many in our world resort to every day of dealing with stress and anxiety, is that they resort to alcohol or illegal drugs. But that definitely happens. And it's a struggle when you find yourself anxious over what to do, but it's a signal alerting us to pray. Look at what Paul said in Philippians 4, verse 6. Hurston read this. I want to read it from the New Living Translation. It says, "Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything." You see, when you're feeling that stress and anxiety, that's that check engine light of your life that's coming on, and it's saying, hey, right now you need to stop and you need to pray. And you need to pray about what? What does Paul say we need to pray about? Everything. And that's a challenge because sometimes we don't feel like what is going on is that big of a deal, even though it is. If it's big enough for us to worry about, then it's big enough for us to pray about. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I just feel like, man, this is really not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. I don't want to bother God with it because I know it's not a huge deal, even though it's a big deal to me because I'm stressed and I'm worried about it. But perspective has told me in the grand scheme, 20 years from now, it's probably not going to matter that much. But in the moment right now, it really matters. All right, so I'm going to talk to the adults for a minute this morning. So sorry, kids and teenagers, you're going through this, or we'll go through this. So we're just going to, I'm not going to address you for just a minute. I just need to remind the adults of something that several of them experienced as they were growing up. All right, adults, do you remember when you were a teenager? And I know for some, that was way back in the 1900s. That was like 20, 30, 50 years ago. So I want you to go back in your mind. I'm going to guess that there are some of you in this room who, when you were in high school, you thought you had found the one. And it's not the one that you're sitting next to right now. It was another one. And you thought you had found your soulmate. I mean, they were the one. It was an intense relationship. You'd already talked about wedding plans. You had planned your whole life out. You talked through how many children you were going to have. You've already picked out their names, whether they were a girl, whether they were a boy. You knew where you were going to live, what your careers were going to be. It was the most intense 2-month relationship you've ever had in your life. And then it ended, and it broke your heart. And you felt crushed. So maybe you went to your parents, and you told them what was going on. And you called your friends, and through the tears, you're sharing your heartbreak. In the moment, that was a really big deal, wasn't it? Now, as you look back on that, you realize, okay, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't as big of a deal as I thought, because it wasn't the one that I was going to spend the rest of my life with. But in the moment, it was a big deal. And maybe you even had people in your life who were like, I know it feels like a big deal, but it's really not a big deal. I don't know if you've ever had surgery before, but you know, they describe surgery as major surgery and minor surgery, and you know the difference between the two, right? A minor surgery is something that happens to somebody else. If it's happening to you or if it's happening to me, it's a really big deal. I don't care if it's dealing with an ingrown toenail, extracting a wisdom tooth. That is all the same as some type of major invasive surgery. Because if you're coming at me with a knife, whether it is medically or as a threat, I don't care. It's a really big deal. So that's the only difference. Well, when it comes to the things that we're struggling with the things that are going on, if it's happening to me, it's a big deal. And if it's something that I am worrying about, if it's a big deal to me, it's a big deal to God. That's why Paul said pray about everything. He didn't say pray about the big things. He didn't say pray about the important things. He didn't say pray about the things that in 20 years will still be a big deal. He didn't say pray about the eternal things. He said pray about everything. Because if it's a big deal to you, it's a big deal to God. And then he gives us a promise. He says, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Now let's just pause for a minute. Don't forget where Paul is writing this from. He's sitting in a Roman prison. He's been arrested for teaching in Jesus. And he's been thrown in prison. It's possible he's shackled to the floor. And within eyesight, there's probably a prison guard. And you can imagine whether Paul is writing this with his own hand or whether he's dictating this, that as he scribes that line, as he says that line, the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus, that he looks up and he sees that prison guard. And he probably smiles and smirks like, oh yeah, that's really good. I'm in prison. I know that's how I would have responded. If that would have come across, it would have been like, oh wow, that's really awesome. I'm literally being guarded by a guard in prison. Peace will guard. Yeah, you know he did it. I mean, you have to, right? You're in prison. You got to make the best of the situation. But that's what he's promising, that God's peace will guard us just like a guard guards the prisoner. Now, question, what does a guard in a prison guard the prisoners from doing? A couple of things. One, from running away. And two, from creating more chaos. Now, let me ask you this. He says the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds. Have you ever found during a time where you're battling stress, anxiety, that your mind starts to run away from you? That all of a sudden these thoughts just start to overwhelm you and you're just thinking 90 miles an hour, worried about all the things that could possibly happen, a lot of scenarios that will probably never play out. And your mind is just racing. You can't sleep, you can't focus, because what is your mind doing? It's running away from you. Paul says, God's peace will guard you. Have you ever found in your heart when you're stressed and anxious that you start making decisions trying to fix the situation, things that you think will help the situation only to make it worse? And now all of a sudden this decision has complicated the issue because you couldn't make a decision that was separated from your emotions. You couldn't step back and see the greater perspective because you're so wrapped up in this problem right now. You're so consumed by the stress and anxiety that your heart told you to make a decision that is just complicating the scenario, and all of a sudden the situation is even more chaotic, and you didn't mean to make it worse, but you did. You dug a deeper hole. God's peace is there to guard our hearts and minds from creating more chaos in our situation. It's a beautiful promise, and what Paul says when that happens is that it will surpass all understanding. NIV, I think, says it will transcend all understanding. The idea behind this word surpass or transcend means to rise above, to be superior to rule over like a guard rules over a prisoner. It's a beautiful promise from God for us. It's a reminder that even when you don't have the power to control, you do have the power to surrender. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I struggle sometimes when what I have planned does not work out exactly the way that I think it should. I'm a planner, always have been. And I like for things to work out the way that I want them to. And so if we're running late, I'm stressed. It just is what it is, okay? I'm stressed. If we get stuck in traffic, I've confessed many of my driving weaknesses, and they're really not weaknesses because I feel like I'm a really good driver. It's just everybody else that's a maniac on the roads. But if we get stuck in traffic, it stresses me out, even if we're not running late, because it's not working out the way that I thought. If I've planned an event and I've got all these things that I expect to happen, I've spent time thinking through, and then something doesn't work exactly the way that I thought it would, or it doesn't work out exactly the way that I planned it, it fills my heart with anxiety. And that's something that I'm personally working through and praying through to release that, because I know I can try to control a situation. That's part of my personality. Maybe you're that way, maybe you're not. You're the type of person that's just free-flowing. You just move from one thing to the next, and none of that stuff bothers you. Maybe it's something else. But here's what I have discovered in my own life. Even when I'm trying to control a situation and when stress and anxiety gets out of control in my life and I'm trying to control it, the one thing that I can do is surrender. But man, that's really hard, isn't it? To let go of control and to say, okay, God, you can have it. You can have it. The one thing that we try to avoid in life is pain. And when I experience pain in my life, that's the one thing that I'm quickly trying to remove. But I came across this quote from Lisa TerKeurst. She's a great author, writer, exceptional individual who writes some really powerful stuff. And she said this. She said, God's been tenderly reminding me that pain itself is not the enemy. Pain is the indicator that brokenness exists. Pain is the reminder that the real enemy is trying to take us out and bring us down by keeping us stuck in broken places. Pain is the gift that motivates us to fight with brave tenacity and fierce determination, knowing there's healing on the other side. And in the in-between, in that desperate place where you aren't quite on the other side of it all yet, and our heart still feels quite raw, well, pain is an invitation for God to move in and to replace our faltering strength with His. Man, that's beautiful. That's hard to live, but that's beautiful to read, is it not? Pain is this reminder, it's this invitation to press more into God. Yet when we experience pain, when things are not working out exactly the way that we thought it would, our goal is to remove that from our life as quickly as possible. But the result could be, in trying to control and trying to remove it, that I miss out on something that God is trying to teach me, something that God is trying to refine within me. There's this passage in Isaiah 48 that talks about how God uses the furnace of suffering. That's not a great illusion. That's not a thought that I want to sit and meditate on and have dreams about, the furnace of suffering. But it's a really powerful thought that if you spend some time thinking about it, what God can do through the furnace of suffering. Because if you think about fire, one of the things that fire does, aside from warmth, which is good on a day like today when it's kind of cold, is it refines. It draws out the impure, and it only leaves what needs to be there. And so, for instance, one of the things that the furnace of suffering can do for us is it can help keep us from pride. If you've ever experienced any type of suffering, then you quickly realize you're not as invincible as you thought you were. You're not as in control as you thought you were. You thought you had your life figured out and you had all these plans only to see them hijacked by some event that you never saw coming, and to realize you're not as strong as you thought you were. You're a lot more vulnerable than you wish to admit. But one of the other things that the furnace of suffering can do is it can change our ambitions. Maybe when you were growing up, you had all these dreams and goals. You wanted to climb the ladder of success. You wanted to accumulate this. You want to live in this type house. You want to have this type job. And you had certain ambitions for your life only for them to be changed, because when you go through an intense period of suffering, you actually realize what's most important. And what's most important is not what's sitting in the driveway. It's not what you're storing in the attic or in the storage facility. What's most important is your relationship with God. It's your relationship with your family, with your faith family. When you're left with nothing but what's most important, it's never a possession. It's always people. And it changes our ambitions. But anytime we find ourselves in the furnace of suffering, it also reveals our idols. Because you realize what you're trusting in. If you're trusting in an accumulation of money, or you're trusting in another individual that is not Jesus Christ, you're trusting in an ability that you have that all of a sudden has been taken away. You no longer have for whatever reason. It reveals our idols, what we have put more faith in than we put in God. And I'm not talking about the lip service of faith. I'm talking about the day-to-day matters of faith. When you hit rock bottom, when pain invades your life, when you enter into the furnace of suffering and it burns away all the extra stuff, what you're left with is what you have devoted your life to. And if we're honest with ourselves, we can easily find different idols that have come into our life. And our true source of trust is not God. And so because of that, I love what Lisa said. Pain is an invitation for God to move in and to replace our faltering strength with His. Pain is an invitation to press more into God. So sometimes life deals you circumstances that the only thing that you can do is pray through the pain. God's peace will guard whatever you surrender in prayer. That's the promise that he gave to us. When he says pray about everything, the promise is his peace will guard whatever you surrender in prayer. But the negative of that is true as well. Whatever you don't surrender in prayer, God's peace can't guard because you've not handed it over to him. That's why Paul said, pray about everything. Not just the big things, everything. So I want to go back to David's question from Psalm 11. When the foundations for good collapse, what can good people do? I want to share with you his response. It goes very closely to what Paul wrote in Philippians 4. He said, but the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord still rules from heaven. You see, when you're refusing to pray over something that you're worried about, it's not just a prayer issue, it's a trust issue. Because in that moment, it's not just that you're worried, it's that you're refusing to trust God. You feel like either God doesn't care or God doesn't care enough to act, or God's not going to act, or God's not going to act the way that you think he should. But the fact that God is still in his holy temple is a reminder that God is still king, he's still reigning above. And as every good father, he is tenderly compassionate to all of the problems that we deal with. So where is God when you need him? He's right where he's always been. He's reigning on high, and he's dwelling within you through his Spirit if you've surrendered your life to him. So when life hands you circumstances you have no idea what to do, the first response is to pray. Pray about everything. And what you'll notice is that regardless of whether or not your circumstances change as a result of prayer, what you will find is your heart has changed as a result of your prayer. You'll find that your trust in him has grown even more. And it's a challenge to me to not just pray about my circumstances and to ask God to change them, but to pray even more about my trust in him. God, when I don't know what to do, I just want to trust in you even more. It's what Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. Take this cup from me, not as I will, but as you will. He didn't just pray for his circumstances. He prayed for his trust in his Father. And that's the challenge for us. When you don't have the power to control, you always have the power to surrender. So this morning, if you need to surrender to Christ, if you need to surrender to him, to give your life to him, to be baptized into Jesus, we'd love to celebrate that with you today. If you're a believer here this morning and there's something you've been holding on to, you've been worried about, you haven't truly surrendered that to God, I want to encourage you, as we sing this song in just a moment, to surrender that to him, to lay that before him, and to ask God to take it from you, to work in that situation, and to replace your worry and anxiety with his peace. Our shepherds will also be in the front and in the back, and if you want them to pray with you and to encourage you, they'd love to do that. Don't handle that alone this morning. If we can help you in any way, please let us know as we stand and sing.